Edexcel Economics 2024, paper 1, of course a microeconomics paper. Let's get started right away and let's go straight to section A. So let's get started with question 1. So it's an explain question, first things first, 4 marks. And so explain what, and it looks like we have a table here. So explain one likely reason. So they want one reason for the difference in the PED for the 18 plus student bus ticket and the adult bus ticket. And just after reading the question itself, the first thing this reminds me of, and a few of you will know this as well, is price discrimination. So of course, price discrimination, why do firms do it? To make more profit. And how do they make more profit? They split the consumer base into elastic demand consumers, which pay lower prices, and inelastic demand consumers, which pay higher prices. And that's one of the biggest examples, one of the main examples we use are train tickets, bus tickets, where under 16s get lower prices and over 16s get higher prices. And what's the theory? What do we learn about that? As under 16s have a lower income, they have less money, therefore they're only able to pay a certain amount. Therefore they're very responsive to change in price. Whereas over 16s, adults for example, they have an income, therefore they're much less responsive to change in price, thus representing their relative elasticities. But yeah, that's what just firstly came to my mind. But now, let's actually address the question and let's firstly look at this table. So this table shows the PED of demand for bus tickets in London 2021. And what does this actually show us? So it shows us the numerical value of PED. So of course, as an A-level student and for Edexcel, you will need to interpret what these PED values mean. So 0.7 and 0.4, this means both of these PED values are inelastic. So like I said, since 0 and 1 are inelastic and 1 and above is elastic, this means the closer you are to 1, the closer you are to being elastic, or the less inelastic you are. So what does this table show? It shows that 18 plus essentially students have a higher degree of elastic demand, or a more accurate way to word it, they are less inelastic compared to adults, great spelling by me there, but compared to adults who are closer to that 0, so who are closer to having a PED of 0, thus they are more inelastic. So it's all about relativity. Adults are relatively more inelastic than students. So let's get on with answering the question. First thing first, the question is mentioning PED. It's a 4-mark question. I would either write the formula here or define PED, but for revision's sake, we'll do a little definition for PED. So how do you define PED? PED, of course, measures how responsive quantity demanded is to a change in price. So now answering the question, what is the reason for the difference? So the difference we've identified is that students are less inelastic, whereas adults are more inelastic. But what is the reason for this? And like I said, it roots back to like the price discrimination point, where students have lower incomes. Now this is a phrase I use a lot in inequality type questions, but it's all to do with proportion of income. Since students have a lower relative income compared to adults, they may have no income compared to adults. Thus, this bus ticket, is a much larger proportion of their income. Thus, any changes in price affects them disproportionately more than an adult. As an adult, for example, might have £1,000 in his bank, whilst a student might only have £3 for that bus ticket. So any changes in the price of that bus ticket may mean that he just generally cannot afford it. And that is how I've decided to word it. Just always remember, with these 4-mark questions, 1 mark is always awarded for application, so you need to make sure you hit that point. So what I've said is one reason for students' bus tickets, PED, being relatively less inelastic is as they have lower income / less money. Thus the bus ticket makes up a higher proportion of their income, so they are more responsive to a change in price compared to adults who are more inelastic. Well, I've just said, since a PED value is closer to 0, if you really wanted to, you could quote the relative PED values. But yeah, that is how to get 4 out of 4 on this 1A, and let's move on to the next question. So let's dissect this question. In 2021, the 7-day adult bus ticket was £21.90. Bus ticket prices in London in 2022 increased by 4.8%. Assuming ceteris paribus, which of the following is the percentage decrease in the 7-day bus ticket demand by adults? So it's given us price, it's given us demand. What is it wanting us to use here? Of course, the PED formula. So of course, like we wrote up there, it's percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. So we're gonna have to use the information we have up here to now work this out. Okay, so how do we do this? So they've given us the percentage change in price, which is 4.8. It's asking us to work out the percentage decrease in demand, which of course is quantity demanded. So this is our X in our formula, and then we have the PED up here of adults bus tickets, which is minus 0.4. So all we have to do is pretty much 0.4 times 4.8, which will give us 1.92, which of course is the answer B, so that would be right. One thing I can see that might have tripped students up is that in the question it says bus ticket prices in 2022, but then the PED is given us is 2021. So the PED value is in 2021, whilst the quantity demanded change is in 2022. But my best tip for this is you just have to work with the data they've given you. So of course it doesn't make complete sense, but there's no actual other way to answer this question. So yeah, just plug in the data you have and don't worry too much about the details. And of course, in this situation, it would be right and it would be B. So yeah, that is question 1 done. 5 marks out of 5 marks again there. And let's move on to question 2. So again, another table, going straight to question, another 4-mark question with reference to the data above, another price elasticity, but this is supply in this scenario. Explain one likely reason. So one reason for the difference, and explain question for the difference in the PES, so the price elasticity of supply, and it shows the PES of housing in the US in 2020, and it shows that Texas has a much higher PES than New York. And like I said in the last question, this should really emphasize to you to revise if you do not know how to interpret these PES, PED values. So of course, just like before, between 0 and 1 represents inelastic, and in this scenario is supply, and of course above 1, so 1 and above 1 is elastic supply. So this data is showing us that New York has inelastic supply. What does inelastic supply mean? It means that even when there is a change in price, producers cannot supply much more. Whereas, of course, elastic supply shows that when prices change, producers have the ability to increase production more than proportionally to a change in price. Pretty much, you can answer this exactly the same. It's the same structure as the last question. So New York, of course, is a very popular city compared to Texas is still popular, but New York's like the big one, isn't it? And so why do you think the supply is going to be more inelastic in New York? It's going to be to do with spare capacity, since it's just New York is very much like London, where there's not much space. There's everything is basically filled up. So with New York, it's going to be harder to increase the amount of houses, harder to increase supply, since it's very ram-packed almost. So not much spare capacity. It's already at pretty much full capacity. Whereas Texas probably has lots of land where you can build houses on, therefore meaning that it's more elastic. The supply of houses is more elastic. So just like before, going to start with defining price elasticity of supply, then move on to the explanation, then lastly add some application for that one application mark. So of course, just like before, literally just swapping the word demand for supply. PES measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied to a change in price. So that's the definition done. Now I'm going to move on to the actual reasoning. So one reason why New York has a inelastic supply compared to Texas's inelastic supply, of course, quarter figures, it will get you the application marks as well, then explaining that it's just due to the lack of spare capacity and just contrasting them both. And that is how to get 4 out of 4 marks there. Start with the definition, then just explain. So got my application marks by quoting the figure, just telling them what I mentioned earlier. So New York being inelastic whilst Texas being elastic, and then just mentioning why that happens. It's due to New York having a lack of spare capacity there, or essentially they have a lack of land, they have a lack of resources, as maybe all the land has already been built on, whereas Texas is the opposite. They have lots of spare capacity, they have lots of potential capacity which they can build on, thus meaning they have more elastic supply. So let's now move on to the second question in this question 2, which is a multiple choice question. So in Texas, the price elasticity of supply is 1.8. Which of the following is the percentage increase in price? So increase in price if quantity of houses supplied in Texas increased by 12%. So literally exactly the same structure as last time. We're just using the formula and filling it in again. So what 2 pieces of data we have here? We have the PES here, which is 1.8. So let's fill that in, and then we also have the quantity of house supplied in Texas increased by 12%. So quantity supplied, which of course is the top of the formula. So X. So we need to find out the percentage change in price, the percentage increase in price. So how would we find that out? Of course, you need to know how to manipulate a very simple equation, which all you would do is 12 divided by 1.8, and that would therefore give you 6.6 recurring, which is of course is C, which is 6.67. The simplest way to remember this, since 12 is above, you kind of just do 12 divided by 1.8, and when X is below, you just do it times. And when X is above, you just times them together. But you're not here for a maths lesson. And that is how to get 5 marks out on question 2. And let's move on to question 3. Okay, we have a diagram, which is always exciting. Cost revenue diagram also, which is even more exciting. But yeah, so draw a cost revenue diagram, 4 marks of course, to illustrate the different business objectives: profit maximization and revenue maximization. Very good question and very simple question. This is like a 4-mark question. You probably get done in 2 minutes. And yes, it's a great question to have, especially if your content knowledge is any. Even with the very limited content knowledge, you should be able to get this. But of course, where do we find profit maximization? Where MC equals MR. Or where do you find revenue maximization? Where MR equals 0. So let's label up this. Let's start with labeling the diagram. So of course, cost slash revenue is a cost slash revenue diagram on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we have quantity. And now, of course, we just draw a nice little, what I call a monopoly diagram. Start with D equals AR. Then we have MR. Then we have AC, then we have MC, and let's do the first one, which is profit maximization. Of course, I do have the luxury of different colors, so we will use them here. So MC equals MR at this point. I'm going to label this Q mark, then go up from there, which would give me, until I hit the AR curve, then go left from there, which would give me P max. And now let's find the box of super normal profit, which you just go up from Q marks until you hit your AC curve. And that is now the box of super normal profit. Bang, bang, bang. So I'm just going to label this super normal profit. I'm going to say profit maximizing just to make it clear. And then now let's go on to our second objective, which is of course revenue maximizing. Now, where do we find revenue maximization? This is where MR equals 0. And what do we do from there? We go up from where MR equals 0 until we hit our AR curve and go left from there. Now I'm going to label this P rev, and then of course we can label that Q rev. And now, same thing again, let's find that box of super normal profits. How to do that? We go from Q rev, we keep going up until we hit our AC curve, then we go left from there. And now this would give us our second box of super normal profit, which I'm going to put super normal profit, and then revenue max. And that is I need to shed it in. But that is pretty much it, and that is very quickly how to get. And of course I was recording as well, so probably if I was doing this in the exam I could do quicker. Don't rush it too much though, since you don't want to make any silly mistakes. But yeah, so that's pretty much how to get 4 out of 4 marks on that. And let's move on to section B, the second part of the question, which is let's have a read of it. So if Peloton, I think it says, if Peloton changes its business objectives to sales maximization, then without making a loss. That's a bit weirdly worded. So of course, sales maximization is just when a firm maximizes sales without making a loss. And where do we usually see that? We see sales maximization where it is at this point where AC equals AR, because that is where a firm can maximize its sales without making a loss. And I'm pretty sure this is what the question is also asking us. So nice little 5 marks on just different business objectives. So where average cost equals average revenue, which of course is what I've just labelled up as average cost, average revenue. They do meet, they do intersect at that point there. So yeah, that answer would be A, since of course we don't even need to look through the rest of them. But let's see what the rest of them do say. So where average cost is minimised, that will not be correct, since there's lots of points on the AC curve where average cost could be minimised. You could even mention that MES is where the average cost is technically minimised. But what is sales max is where we want to maximise the number of sales without making a loss. So we want that break-even point essentially. So it would not be B. The PED is equal to -1. That really has nothing to do with anything, so that would not be C. And then D is price equals marginal cost. So what does price equal marginal cost represent? That represents this point here. And what is this point also known as? That is of course known as allocative efficiency, which is of course not sales maximizing, therefore would not be D this year. That's how to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 3. Just one little thing I want to clarify, on your cost revenue diagram, you can, for the x-axis, you can put quantity or you can put output, both of them work. But yeah, so that's 5 out of 5 on your, also with your y-axis, if you really wanted to, they also accept price slash cost. There's lots of different variations for the axes, but just make sure you've got, they're pretty much the only variations, but just make sure you've got that down. But yeah, anyway, let's now move on to the next question. So another 4-mark question, another explain question. It's quite a nice chunky paper this is. But so explain one likely reason for the maximum price on undergraduate university program. So essentially the maximum price on tuition fees, I think, yeah, it's mentioning. So in 2022, the government announced that the maximum undergrad tuition fee for universities will remain at 9.25 per year for the next 2 years. This is actually now changed. So in 2024 now, I believe by 2029 it's going to go up to 10.5 for university students, but that is besides the point. But yeah, back to the question, what is one likely reason for this maximum price? So just like our other 4-mark questions, you start with defining it, then explanation, then a bit of application. Since it's talking about maximum price, I think it is actually really quick and really easy just to draw out a diagram. This is why I always say, so of course, price, quantity. I always say practice your diagrams a lot, since especially for these section A's, it means you can draw them out really quickly as well, which of course you don't want to waste too much time drawing diagrams either. So not great drawing there, but so supply, demand, and then where is a maximum price set? Is it set below or above the equilibrium price? Of course, what is a maximum price trying to do? It's a price ceiling, so we don't want prices to reach above that point. So it's going to be set below the equilibrium price, as essentially the reason why we set maximum prices is that the equilibrium price is too high. So we're trying to encourage consumption of a good. Maximum prices, it should remind you a lot of like positive externalities. This example specifically, we go through it. I remember going through it last year in our live classes. It's a great example of positive externalities. The government gain a great return on education, on subsidising university degrees, which is of course why they do it. They're trying to encourage consumption of this positive externality, as it does bring benefit to society as a whole. But yeah, of course, and this would be our maximum price, and you can label on that would be QS and that would be QD. And here it's actually giving us the some tuition fees will remain at 9,250 a year. So to pick up a few more application marks, or just to pick up the one application mark in this question, you can just write that being 9,250, since that is of course the value of the maximum price. So that would pick up most of your content knowledge application marks, but just to make it a bit more straightforward, I'm just going to define firstly maximum prices. Okay, so for an explanation, you don't need to put it this long, but I've just mentioned how uni degrees, and like I said, this is pretty much the example I teach in the live classes, a great example of positive externalities, specifically positive consumption externalities, are university degrees. As like I said, the government receives a great return on them. But since they are positive externalities, what is the main characteristic of anything with positive externalities is that they're underconsumed. So what does the government have to do? Well, what should the government do? They should intervene in the market to encourage the consumption of these goods with positive externalities, which is exactly what they're doing with a maximum price. Why? Since a maximum price lowers the price from equilibrium price. Thus, of course, as we know, via the law of demand, when prices are lower, there's an increased demand. So with low prices, it incentivizes more students to pursue university as it's cheaper. You could talk about low income individuals, it's now cheaper for them as well, so they can now pursue it. But essentially overall leading to that positive externalities now being internalized, that potential welfare gain that society wasn't gaining has now been gained. And yeah, it's positive for society. And yeah, that's exactly how I would get 4 marks out of 4 marks on this question. Let's move on to the last 1 marker on this. So which of the following is an example of government failure associated with the maximum price? So of course, looking back to the diagram, what does the maximum price lead to? What is this discrepancy between quantity supplied and quantity demanded represent? Since one of the main negatives, one of the main evaluations we speak about with regards to maximum price is that the market is no longer at equilibrium. Since before the maximum price, the market of course reached equilibrium at that blue circle, where quantity supplied equal quantity demanded. But now, with the government intervening in the market, with the artificial intervention in the market, there is now a discrepancy. There's now a discrepancy between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And what does that discrepancy represent? It represents excess demand. And if you actually remember back to government failure, one of the main types of government failure is distortion of the price mechanism. So one type of government failure is distortion of the price mechanism, and that's exactly what the government have done here. They've intervened in the market and almost ruined quantity demanded and quantity supplied, since they've set a price ceiling. So the answer for that question would of course be, so there's no actual option for excess demand itself, but B actually looks quite right. Distortion of price signals. So like I mentioned, one of the main types of government failure is distortion of the price mechanism. Another word for that is distortion of price signals. Let's quickly run through the other ones. Contraction in demand, which of course is not correct since there's an extension in demand. There's excess demand. Excess supply, which is incorrect since at lower prices, less producers want to supply. And extension in supply, which of course is incorrect. So yeah. Let's get 5 out of 5 marks on question 4. Now let's move on to the last question in section A, which is looking like a graph question. So largest mortgage lenders in the UK in 2020 by market share. So big graph, you call it a graph, yes. Let's see the question. Another 4 marker to end it off. So with reference to information on the preceding page, very technical terms, explain 4-mark question, the market structure of mortgage lending in the UK. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 7 large firms. So an easy way to identify this, anything between 2 to 10 firms can be oligopolistic, and usually the main distinction is the 4-firm concentration ratio. If it's around 60%, it does really indicate an oligopolistic market structure. But let's see if we need to calculate that for the question. So explain the market, so it's asking us, so I've just forgot the question, but explain the market structure of mortgage lending in the UK. So of course, like I said, I would call it oligopolistic, I can't spell, listic market. And to prove that, I am just going to work out the 4-firm concentration ratio. What is 4-firm concentration ratio? The 4 largest firms in the market, which would be Lloyds, Nationwide, Santander, and NatWest, which would give me a 4-firm concentration ratio of 54.2%. So I'm going to write that down. 4 firms. So like I said, anything around 60% does prove it's a fairly oligopolistic market, which of course here with 54% is very close to it. So 4-firm conc ratio, so you in the exam write concentration ratio, but it's 54.2%. And this actually might be one of the easiest 4-mark questions there are, since now all you have to do, and it's a very quick question, is just explain what an oligopolistic market is. So of course the main thing is few large dominant firms, and then just pretty much what you've revised, what your content knowledge on oligopolistic market structures and oligopolistic firms. So what are the characteristics? So the few large dominant firms, and of course one of the big ones is interdependence. They all depend on each other to entry, and they do usually have high concentration ratios, and this will be more than enough for these 4 marks. I think I would have only needed 2 of these characteristics, since we picked up. There'll be 1 mark here for identifying it, maybe 2 marks there for the concentration ratio itself. But yeah, that's all I'd write there, and that is how to get 4 out of 4 marks on that question. And that is just a really simple, quick content knowledge test of your content on market structures. So yeah, make sure you're up to speed with that. So the value of all mortgages was 1.6 billion by the end of 2020. Which of the following is the value of Lloyd's market share? So Lloyd's has 19.5% market share. So of course, all we would have to do there is take that 1601 divided by 100 times it by 19.5, and that would give me 312.195. But of course, that gives me C, and of course the answer there for would be C, since of course that is how to work it out. So just to make my calculation clear, I did, since this is the total value of all the mortgages, which is 1.6 billion essentially, divided it by 100 to give me 1%, and then since Lloyd's market share was 19.5%, times it by that, which gave me 312 billion. But yeah, that is section A done. That is how to get 25 out of 25 on your section A.